The 90s. We had Turtle Power, we had Ecto Cooler, and we had some of the very worst comic books ever printed and sold for actual money. Or at least, that's how many comic book fans have chosen to remember the decade. Me, I do what I can to put this assertion to the test. Right here on 90s Comic Street Trial, where I go through my own personal collection of comic books, stuff that I own, that is taking up space in my house, that I acquired mostly between 1992 and 1996. I go through these things with fresh eyes and try to see if the decade is in fact as bad as its reputation. Now, this marks the video debut of what had once upon a time been the primary podcast feature of the Council of Geeks podcast feed. I've been thinking for some time about trying this out in a video format, especially because I spend a lot more time on YouTube than I do podcasting, and I really went back and forth on what comic to start with. Initially, I was going to do a video version of my recently wrapped up coverage of Executioner's Song, which was how that podcast ended, because that proved to be biting off more than I could chew, and honestly, covering that thing kind of broke me. I have since decided that, at least for the time being, I don't want to talk about issues or stories that I already covered in podcast form. Thus, I dug through my pile of 90s comics from Image, because nobody was more 90s than Image, and pulled out the first Cyberforce annual. Now, this being my first attempt at video format, I'm going to end up inevitably taking a few cues from the comic book reviews of Linkara. However, I'm going to try really hard to not just rip him off wholesale. So let's dig into Cyberforce Annual number 1 and see how this particular preserved piece of 90s extreme holds up 25 years later.
90s Comics Trial. 90s Comics Trial. 90s Comics Trial.
Something you'll probably pick up right away into this, and I should be upfront about, I don't really do research. It makes me break out in a rash, so don't expect a ton of background, or context, or information, or other stories with these characters, stuff about the creators. The approach of this is to revisit these comics the same way I read them when I first bought them, with whatever working knowledge I already had, and sometimes that's a fair bit. Sometimes that is next to nothing. In this case, it was kind of in the middle. I know that Cyberforce was created by Marc Silvestri and was one of the big teams of the Marvel Image titles, along with Youngblood, Brigade. There were a few others, but those are the ones off the top of my head. They're almost... this group anyway is pretty much the most blatant X-Men ripoff that the company was doing, and most of these were X-Men ripoffs. It was actually a little bit surprising coming from Silvestri, given that he had worked on Uncanny X-Men over at Marvel before he and the other founders of Image split off to form that company. You'd think he'd know better than to rip off what he was previously just working on, but even, for being a ripoff, it is not subtle about its influence. It deals with people who have innate abilities. There are numerous characters who are practically one-to-one analogs, right back to specific X-Men. Ripclaw's Wolverine, Stryker's Cable, Impactus Colossus, Cyblade is Psylocke, etc., etc. There are tweaks here and there, a few mashups. Velocity is Kitty Pryde with Quicksilver's power set, but, the templates are painfully obvious. The difference in terms of the pitch is that these aren't only mutants, they were also experimented on, having been cybernetically modified by, and are now fighting against, the machinations of the shadowy Cyberdata Corporation. And I might end up saying Cyberdata, so forgive me. Basically what they did was they applied Wolverine's Weapon X backstory to every single member of the team. And as a kid, around the age of 11, I thought this was the coolest thing ever. We'll see if that remains the case. So, Cyberforce Annual number 1 has a cover date of March 1995. It was plotted by Marc Silvestri and Mike Heisler, with the latter also on scripting duties. David Finch was the penciler, Nathan Cabrera was on inks. There was a whole team of folks on coloring duties with David Wohl handling the lettering. So that's credits out of the way. Let's start with the cover. And broadly speaking, it's pretty solid in concept. Image was always really big on covers where the hero or team of heroes are just kind of posed there. But there's a lot more sense of story than usual in this particular cover from, versus other Image stuff at the time. We've got a graveyard at dusk. It's got former villain Ballistic holding the possibly dead body of her younger sister Velocity, and shadowed in the background, we have most of the remaining members of Cyberforce. From left to right, in case you happen to be wondering, we have Ripclaw, Heatwave, Dominique with Impact behind her, and then Stryker on the far right. All well and good as a concept and a general composition, so it really does break my heart that the details completely let this down. Firstly, of the 6 people possibly dead, 5 of them are going for stone-faced stoicism. Dominique has a little bit more of emotion in her pose and expression, but honestly, it's so low-key, I could just as easily believe that she's got an upset stomach from eating Chipotle. This is most evident on the face of Ballistic, who just has no expression at all. I'm pretty sure those are meant to be tears over on her left eye, but they look more like prison tattoos. They really needed a streaking tear down the cheek, if that's what they were trying to go for. Or would that not have been badass enough? Hell, the person with the most expression is the one who might be dead. But let's get off faces and talk about where the real effort appears to have been put when it comes to the work on this cover. It's the boobs. Holy cleavage, Batman. I'm not sure how long I can linger on these shots without getting flagged for inappropriate content, but notice how much tension there is in Ballistic's neck. What is going on there? Looks like she's straining her neck just to be sure her head isn't even slightly blocking the view of her rack. Then there's Velocity with her bodysuit so tight she might as well just be naked. Anyways, inside, it opens with Velocity setting up a training exercise for herself, and it's totally different from the Danger Room in X-Men because it's in the woods and not actually in a room. The danger field. Out of boredom, she ups the difficulty level from 2 to 5 and is immediately beset upon by big, vicious robots. I just want to ask, if she's just a trainee, why does she have clearance to up the danger level that high? Like, on Star Trek with the holodeck, only the highest ranking officers could disable the safety protocols on the holodeck, because you don't give that kind of authority to someone who hasn't proven themselves to be responsible. And with that Star Trek comparison, I think I just invited even more accusations of ripping off Linkara, because he's kind of big into Star Trek. So I'd better move on from that. So inevitably, Velocity gets in over her head, but the exercise is terminated by the android Timmy, whose name is in fact an anagram for Totally Independent Mobile Machine Intelligence Experiment, since nobody asked. Velocity expresses her frustration, partly stemming from just wanting to improve faster and partly due to the fact that Cyberdata locked her memory. She basically guilts Timmy into brain scanning her, which naturally goes even more wrong than the training exercise did. This is the point where we start getting flashbacks to Velocity's childhood in black and white with a few pops of colors on things like Velocity's hair, which, I'll be honest, it's a nice touch. And presumably, she's experiencing these flashbacks as the reader is. But in the real world, she's totally non-responsive, and the rest of the group, having been called in by Timmy, fears that they tripped some kind of defense function in the brain box that Cyberdata had implanted. The Cyberforce team determines that the only way that they're going to save Velocity is to take her to a Cyberdata facility, I know words, and hope that the source of the problem might have a means to, in fact, correct it. Meanwhile, Velocity's memories have taken a nasty turn. After starting with her playing with her family and her sister, we now get treated to a broken home where her father's left, and the man who's taken his place is pretty much a walking wife-beater stereotype, like complete with tank top, beer in hand. Cassie, Velocity's older sister, who later becomes Ballistic, tries to confront the man, and Velocity runs off to get help from the first cop she can find. And when I say runs off, I mean she really runs. This isn't quite the thing where their powers develop later. Now, the cop arrives to find the man dead, with a comb having been thrown by Cassie so hard that it impaled him in the chest. Not sure why his face is bloody, though. The flashback jumps ahead a bit. Velocity is now being shown at the Sunshine Orphanage, where apparently preteens not only have access to tattoo guns, but they're able to ink a perfect lightning bolt on the face of a struggling, super fast child. Following the tattoo session, Velocity and her tormentor are informed by the mutant Mother May-I that they will be going with these very nice men in black suits now, and they're both promptly thrown in the back of a van by what I'm gonna presume are cyber data operatives. Now, coming back to the real world, we jump to Queens, where a guy in a very cheap-looking suit jacket is hitting on a blonde at a bar. That is, until the cybernetic arm of Stryker grabs him and tells him to beat it. I do actually know this from other issues. This is a bit of a running joke, because this guy keeps trying to hit on Ballistic in this specific bar and being scared off or shooed away by Stryker or other mutants. So, I guess it's funny if you've been keeping track. I thought it was funny at the time. Anyways, Stryker fills her in on what's been going on, and she joins the team in transporting Velocity to Cyberdata. More flashbacks, bit of a life in Cyberdata training montage. And in real time, Ballistic gets to work on breaking the team in to Cyberdata, blasting away a Sentry who I honestly couldn't figure out if it was meant to be a robot or a human in armor. Like the speech bubble says robot, but it has like a response, which to me says human, whatever. They break in, they run into more maybe robot guards, fighting happens, and then Velocity is hooked up to the Technobabble machine, and Cyberdata sends its heavy hitters. Now, before I want, to get into any more, I need to talk about one of these characters, the character of Killjoy. Now, I encountered this character in Cyberforce issue number 2, and I immediately fell in love with her. Character-wise, she's got a bit of a Starscream thing going on, appearing to have criticism toward the team leader, which at the time I read that issue was Ballistic, and possibly even plans to undermine her outright. Now, the thing is, unlike Starscream, Killjoy is both way more subtle about what she's up to, and also really competent at her role in the team, proves her value handily and repeatedly. But what I really loved about her was how unsexualized she looked. My first time reading Cyberforce number 2, I actually didn't even realize that Killjoy was a woman. I'm serious. It went completely over my head. I didn't pick up on it until subsequent rereads of that issue. There's a couple reasons for this. Partly it's the costume design, partly it's how lithe her overall proportions are, but mostly it's the fact that she isn't posed in a manner that screams, "Check out this chick!" There's really only one image of her in that issue where there's even the slightest hint of a bust, and she doesn't have crazy hips either. I thought she was maybe a slender ninja type guy, and when I actually realized that she was a woman, it blew my young mind. I imagine it was similar to like the first time that players beat the original Metroid and suddenly realized that Samus was a woman. Like, wow, this insane kick-butt person is a woman? Ha! Cool! Now, having said all that, in this issue, this is how they depict her. What in the cavernous depths of hell's navel is this? I honestly, I can't even break this down. Just look at it. Look at it! everybody who was involved in this, who knew that the character was going to be drawn in this issue like this, and failed to speak up and stop what was happening, needs to be very ashamed of themselves. And yes, even 23 years later, they should still be ashamed. As for me, I gotta move on. So anyway, she shows up with some of her less interesting cronies like Megawatt, Hotspur, Buzzcut, and the other one. We got more fighting. It lasts a little bit longer than with the guards since it's supposed to be, like the scary bad guys fight. I'm reminded once again of what a blatant X-Men ripoff this is as the villain Hotspur takes on Psyblade, who has the power of psionic blades. And looks like this. This is beyond shameless. Anyways, Hotspur gets taken down from behind by Heatwave and possibly even straight up killed, judging by the art, before facing off against Psychotron. Right! That was the other one's name. Okay. No wonder I couldn't remember. Jeez. It's dumb. Anyway, more characters face off, but we actually don't see much of it because the bigger issue is Killjoy breezing her way past Ripclaw and getting ready to completely wipe Velocity's brain. But Killjoy ends up taking a few bullets due to ballistics showing up, and she calls a retreat as a result. I guess Hotspur isn't dead. I honestly don't know why the heroes are letting them walk away. I can't remember if Cyberforce had a no-kill rule or not, but they didn't really seem like the type. They use an awful lot of guns to be non-violent. Anyway, Velocity comes to, she and her sister embrace, and the two reaffirm their love for each other. So, that wraps up Cyberforce Annual #1, which now leaves me to render a verdict on this thing. Ultimately, what I'm usually looking for are particularly egregious examples of 90s excess in terms of story, characters, and especially the art. But it does have to be true excess or true failures. Like, the simple presence of 90s-ness is not enough to condemn a comic. That just makes it a product of its time. Now, back when this was a podcast, I'll point out that the previous issue of Cyberforce that I covered, #2, which I talked about a little bit, that did end up getting convicted. But my heart wasn't really in that verdict, because as silly as the thing was, rereading it, I couldn't help but remember how this art, these characters, the situation had just drawn me in and made me want more. What ultimately condemned that issue was just how disjointed it was, because it felt like the end of the previous issue and the start of the next one were crammed together, but they didn't bother to actually flow from one to the next, and neither half felt like a complete story in and of itself. It was two half stories that barely related. And that's ultimately what sunk that. But that's not at play with this issue. This is a complete story. So should mean things are all good, right? Well, not so fast, because Cyberforce #2 had Killjoy, as she was meant to be, and not whatever the heck this is supposed to be. And also, while these characters have always been blatant X-Men ripoffs, it feels way more blatant and shameless here than it did in that other issue, and plus some others that I have. Like, between the characters, which I pointed out some of the one-to-ones, and finally getting a good look at Mother May-I, who's a character I'd seen referenced before, but hadn't actually seen in art, and ends up just being a ripoff of Mystique. I know in this, she's in black and white, she's actually blue. There's the Danger Room, except it's outdoors. I mean, all of this adds up to this whole concept feeling way more derivative than it ever did before. Now, as far as annuals go and the type of stories that go on in them, it's not bad. It's a complete story, fills in some background for anybody who cares, but it also doesn't feel like folks who would skip this and stick only to the main series would be missing out on anything super vital and wouldn't be able to keep up with the story. But in the end, that's just not enough to overcome the other problems here. The big one just being how generic this all feels. I will maintain that as far as Image teams of the 90s went, Youngblood, Brigade, Cyberforce was about as good as it got in those early days, but it was still Image in the 90s, and it's kind of rare for that to skate by. So, Cyberforce Annual #1 is going to be convicted of 90s era awfulness. For its functional but rote plot, fight scenes that never feel like we get to see all of them, and, just the vandalism of what happens to Killjoy. So, there we go, folks. That's it for this. Cyberforce Annual number 1, Convicted of 90s era awfulness. Again, not thrilled about that, because I do like this title, but yeah, this is not a particularly good piece of work. Not the harshest conviction I've ever laid down or will ever lay down in the future, I'm sure, but it's a conviction nonetheless. So, that wraps up the inaugural video debut of 90s Comics Retrial. If you have enjoyed this, I would recommend that you check out the Council of Geeks podcast feed where the old stuff is up if you want to give it a listen. And depending on how well this does, it might become a monthly feature. That's probably pushing it, because honestly, this took me a lot longer to do than I was expecting it to. But, if it's particularly popular, maybe I'll probably start throwing it out to my Patreon supporters, some options of what comic book issues to cover for future ones. Which I suppose serves as a segue for me to plug the Patreon. So check that out if you want. Links down below. Plus other buttons and stuff and links, things to check out. Give it a look if you feel like it, but if you don't, that is okay. Support is appreciated, but not required, because at the end of the day, folks, if you're watching this, you are the council, and indeed, quite possibly in this case, the jury. I'm just running the meetings, or maybe just delivering the verdicts. But in any case, until next time, this court is adjourned.